Welcome to the Whole Story podcast. This podcast series is focused on inspiring sustainability in agriculture, using the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, also known as the SDGs. Each week, our guests are invited to share their story, highlight a particular one of the 17 goals, and leave us with some practical tips for sustainability on farms. I'm Becks Smith, founder of The Whole Story, a B Corp certified social enterprise inspiring, facilitating, and articulating holistic sustainability in agriculture. And this podcast has been brought to life in partnership with the incredible team at FMG, who are passionate about partnering with organisations like The Whole Story, so together we can support rural New Zealand. So whatever you're doing while listening to this episode, thanks for choosing us. The best way you can support our mahi is to follow and share the show on whatever app you're listening on, and I hope this episode leaves you inspired and excited about the bigger picture of sustainability in agriculture. Today on the Whole Story podcast, I have the utmost privilege of sitting down with Pita Alexander, chartered accountant and founder of Alexander's, a leading agribusiness, accountancy and advisory firm based in Christchurch, but servicing clients nationwide. Pita has been in the agribusiness accountancy game for over 35 years and has seen many boom and bust cycles in agriculture. This episode is based around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. And with Peter's wealth of experience, his thoughts on the importance of good financial management to the sustainability story are not to be ignored. Peter is an avid reader, a global traveller, and a hard worker from humble beginnings. He is still clocking a 7-day week, passionate about what he does and the people he serves. So today on the Whole Story podcast, I'd like to introduce you all to Pita Alexander. Now, he won't be a stranger to many of you. He has had a long and successful career in agricultural accountancy, starting up the firm Alexander's, based in Christchurch. He's now based out of Hamner. How are you, Peter?
I am good. It's a great day here. The view is so good, I shouldn't be paid.
That's wonderful. That's what we all aspire to, having office views that we can just look out and enjoy.
Yes.
So I'd like to crack into it, Peter. Can you tell me a bit about the story of Pita Alexander?
My mother was the glue in our family. I wanted to leave school at 15. I was getting the cane every fortnight at school. I didn't enjoy school at all. I was bottom in the class in English and tended to be top in mathematics. I had 2 paper rounds. I was leasing land growing potatoes. Chippewa potatoes. I don't know whether that variety still applies. But Mum said, no, you're not leaving school, so I had to stay right through. The headmaster never gave me the cane at the time, even though I got sent to his office a lot. He said to me, you're a late developer. You don't swear, you don't bully anybody. You play a lot of tennis and table tennis. You're just a late developer. When I left school and left home to work on farms. I worked on farms around the South Island for about 3 years. My mother said to me, dear, we haven't got any money. You're either going to have to earn it or marry it. At the time, I had a very bad stutter, and I didn't think any self-respecting girl would ever want anything to do with me. So I worked on farms, usually for about 6 months. A lot of farmers didn't like that. They liked you to go for the whole season, but I usually did 6 months. I worked for about a dozen farmers around the South Island, a couple in the North Island. Found I liked farming. I went to Lincoln and did the Diploma of Ag and the Diploma of Valuation Farm Management. Found I enjoyed it and passed out fairly well. Enjoyed both courses. Harry Garrett, Bruce Ride, there was a number of very good lecturers, Monty Cook, that I related to, and they told me at the end of it all, you should deal with people and profits. And at the time, I didn't have any profits, and I had a stutter, so my communication with people was pretty second class. But a stutter tends to improve when you get a bit more confidence in what you're doing in life. And when I finished the VFM, I decided I liked mathematics and that type of approach. So I thought I'd do a Bachelor of Commerce. And at the time joined the rural bank. I made one bad mistake there. I should have gone full-time to the university for a BCom, but I went part-time. I've since trained 21 other young men and women, and I've always suggested they work for me in the holidays and I'll pay them well, give them long hours, and they go full-time, and they all have done. And it was a mistake I just made personally. When I was in the rural bank, my first salary was £918 in the rural bank, 88 cents per hour. Might sound ridiculous, but I was living at home and I was actually saving money at that point. My mother said, "Dear, you work so hard, we're not going to charge you any board or rent." So £918, I had a car supplied, I had a car park supplied at work. I liked working with farmers, lending them money. The chief in Wellington said, "You need to be in bank credit." I said, "No, I quite like just working one-to-one with farmers," but he had the checkbook and I needed the work. So I ended up in bank credit and learnt some really hard lessons. The chief in Wellington said to me, "Why are you doing this, BCom?" And I said, "Because I think I want to." He said, "We've only had one other individual do this, a chap called Wilson Winteray, who was the All Black captain. He only lasted 2 years and then he left the rural bank." Well, that actually is exactly what I did. I left the rural bank after 2 years and joined Pine Gorgonus Trust Department, worked up through the accounting ranks. I thoroughly enjoyed it. They weren't a particularly good paying firm, but they were a very good platform to move on from. And that's what I did. Eventually, after 5 years, I really enjoyed the estate work, the trust, the planning. I enjoyed the strategic thinking that goes on with farming. You get a farmer in the top 2 quartiles and they really want to make progress. There's quite a number in the bottom 2 quartiles, really, as long as they have got enough cash to pay living expenses and keep the family happy. They're not too worried about the return on capital and the yields and all that type of thing. That's just their style. They're still good in the community. It's the top 2 quartiles, though, who want to keep improving. And I found that was the group that I enjoyed working with. So in 1972, I opened a practice on my own account, worked on my own home for the first year. I was always a good saver. I had a philosophy that there's no reason why I couldn't save 30% of my income, which I have done for a long period of time. Certainly early on, you need a partner who is on the same page, but I was lucky in that regard. I met a girl in the rural bank, Maureen, who actually died 11 years ago now, but I never forgot when her parents invited me for tea on the front bench in the kitchen where there was 8 jars for rates, insurance, car expenses, a whole lot of things like that. And I thought any girl who has been through this, dealing with these 8 jars, is something I could cope with, and they'd cope with me. So we had 43 years marriage, and it was a marvellous marriage, 2 kids. When I started up on my own, I found all of a sudden the banks and stock firms and insurance companies wanted some independence sometimes when they were struggling with a loan that had gone wrong. So I spent approximately 3 years troubleshooting all around the South Island and the North Island. At the time, there was Lloyd's issues going on, insurance, and there was wool futures issues. And it was a very good experience. And one day I came home from Palmerston South and my wife said to me, "Maureen, dear, you've had a hard day, I can tell." And I said, "Yes, I've been dealing with a wife all day who was in tears and a husband who was not a very good operator, but was hard to deal with." At that stage, there was a lot of joint lending, stock firms and banks, joint lending. We don't have that so much today, but in those days, it was a problem area, this joint lending. She said to me, "Dear, you're going to be a difficult old man if you're going to continue with this type of work. You come home, you're exhausted, you've had a hard day." The key things, Beck, from all that troubleshooting was about 30% of the men I deal with. At that stage, Mostly, we're talking here in the 1970s. So at that stage, it was mostly men who owned the land and the buildings and the farming operation. Very few wives at that point had a big stake. That big change in the wives owning much bigger stake came with Ruth Richardson, really, from about 1991, somewhere in there. GST, the introduction in 1986, that also had a big bearing on women getting much more involved, and that was a major plus. So I decided I would do less of this troubleshooting work and concentrate on the practice, which I did, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I had a son who went to Shirley Boys High, won the school accounting prize, partly because he's been working for me from about 12 years old. He needed the money. I mean, a lot of young men need money. They need cash. And that was a great thing when you've got a business where they can do some of the work. And he used to come in at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning and say, "Dad, what can I do?" And I'd give him a bundle of bank statements, and he would go away, come back. I'd say, "Don't come back to me until 4 o'clock today." And he got very good at putting a set of farm accounts together. And that was very good. I had a daughter who's now a clinical psychologist. It was much harder for her to get work at the time. It was much harder. It was a memory I had, but she went to university for 7 years, now lives at Ahoka. But I'm getting enormous job satisfaction. I always have done. I've always found working for farming couples is a very satisfying way to make a living. There is a small proportion who don't tend to listen to you, and that is frustrating. But I've given now over 500 talks at seminars and conferences in New Zealand, 102 in Australia, 1 in the United Kingdom, 2 in America. Just really common sense. It's all about strategic planning. I've been trying to get governments to spend more money in schools. In that last schooling year, there's not a lot of point in teaching our children a lot about Shakespeare. We need to be teaching them in that last year a lot about compound interest, how money works, budgeting, money management, discipline. The group that go through real pain in this country are the 17 to 27-year-olds. Unless they've got a very strong bank of mum and dad, they are going to really struggle to get a house deposit together, and then they've got 30 years of paying it off. At the moment, the ownership of houses in New Zealand is about 63% roughly, which is very similar to Canada, Australia, and the USA. It's interesting that the biggest ownership of houses around the world is East European countries, because when communism broke down in 1990, the governments of those countries, like Romania, then offered their people to buy their house. And of course, they bought at a relatively low price. And a lot of places like Romania, I think, have got an ownership of about 90%. It's interesting. I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day on just the articles I want to read. I read the Economist from cover to cover, and I read the UK Guardian cover to cover. I like to read, and I write a lot of articles that seem to get a good feedback. Once again, it's just common sense. It's about life. Life, when you really get down to it, is a big bundle of numbers. And some people get the hang of it. I mean, 30% of the people in this country are poor with money. And that means that their children also will end up being poor with money because they'll learn nothing across the kitchen table. And that is very sad. It means the whole thing keeps perpetuating in a big circle. Whereas the key thing for our children is to learn across the kitchen table. And my children probably got sick of it when they were 15, 16, but they went through a lot of it, and it hasn't done them any harm. Financial discipline is a very, very important issue, and our schools are not teaching it at all, which is a great shame.
I guess leading on from that around financial management is all encompassed to me in sustainability. Now, it's such a big word and it's really super trendy, but I'd love to know from a person with such life experience as yourself, Peter, what sustainability means to you.
Right. Well, I'm a bit hard-nosed on this stuff, Beck, because that's what I've found I can be the best use for farming couples. For example, I'm a firm believer in you eat what you kill. Now, that's a bit unsophisticated, pretty raw, but it's not far from the mark. You need to eat what you kill. For example, I've been saving money in the little post office account in Sydenham. For years and years, I saved my money regularly in there, worked on farms, kept £10 back to live on and then put the rest in there. And I went in there one day and the girl behind the counter said, "The postmaster wants to see you." And I said, "What for?" She said, "I don't know." And she gave me the yellow ledger card and went in and I met the postman. I remember he seemed to be a big man with a big desk, but maybe he wasn't. Anyway, he said to me, "Young Mr. Alexander, you've won a prize." And I said, "What for?" He said, "You haven't had a withdrawal for 10 years. And I hadn't either. I had a little orange passbook. Lots of people have them. The schools encouraged it. There was a little orange passbook. He didn't give me any money, but he credited £30, I remember, to my post office book. I went home, told my mother. She said, "Dear, you're the last boy in the street that actually needs that, but it's probably a good sign." So it gets back to, it's a great shame, for example, that our KiwiSaver business is not compulsory. At the moment, KiwiSaver is going through a low patch, but I think once Mr. Putin gets sick of it all, things will start to improve. But being a good saver is a very important issue. You don't need to go mad about it, but it's a very, very important issue, and a lot of people just aren't good savers. So I'm a great believer in financial management. Sometimes you can't avoid making a loss. The key when you make a loss, though, is to limit the loss. Far too many people, when they make a loss, turn the light out. They think it's not worth it. Oh, damn it, hell to with it, go to the pub. Now, you don't learn much at the pub. You don't learn very much at all. You learn more at the pub, not what to do, than what to do.
What I'm hearing there from you around sustainability is it all starts with good financial management and planning.
It starts across the kitchen table.
Yeah, educating our young people on good financial management and practice.
Yes, and 30%, I'm afraid, of the New Zealanders are poor with money, Becks, and we're not making any progress with it. In the east coast of both the North and South Island of New Zealand, you're going to have a dry period 1 year out of 4, very dry. It's not a bad idea to always have 5 or 10% of your income in the farm income equalisation scheme. Now, it can be hard on your working capital, true, but the scheme still pays 3%. It's a marvellous financial buffer. It's a marvellous emotional buffer. And every time we have a drought on the east coast of both islands, hell breaks loose with working capital, lack of cash, all sorts of pressure.
Yeah, and I think what's really important here is that recognition of the fact that it's really hard to implement environmental initiatives or even just any of the other sustainability initiatives if you haven't got that buffer in place and you haven't got the financial profitability to be able to implement those sort of strategies.
That's very true. If you give any business person, if they have the ability, they're good at their job, they're good at developing cash, they build up some financial reserves. I'm not talking about someone being greedy and what have you, but building a financial reserves is a great thing for any man or woman running a business. They know that if things slip, and at the moment, for example, the world's hardly ever been so fragile as it is right now. Hardly ever been so fragile. If ever there's a time to have financial reserves, I'm not talking about an emergency fund. That's a smaller, different approach. They need financial reserves above the emergency fund to cope with this volatility. And on top of that, I'll guarantee they'll be a better partner and I'll guarantee they'll be a better parent if they have this strong financial situation. I act for a lot of very good farmers, and you'll find if you dig into it, they are getting this emotional support from having a strong financial position. There's hardly anything that competes with it.
No, thank you for going into that. You touched on this before in your description of your life growing potatoes to begin with. Was that your first link to agriculture, that working on farms and growing potatoes, or are your parents from an agricultural background?
My mother was a Shand, S-H-A-N-D. Her brother was the Minister of a National Party MP, Cabinet Minister, and for Marlborough. Had a farm called Seaward Valley, or Blue Duck Valley, just north of Kaikoura. So yes, the farming family was there. Other members of the family were at Island Hills in Culverden. There was a lot of farming, but no capital. And in some ways, that was a major strength. It made me get off my tail. Academically, all my school reports said not motivated, has potential. And my father used to say to me for years and years, when's this potential coming? Well, it never came really. So I was active, playing a lot of tennis and table tennis, and always liked work, Beck. I never had a problem with work. There was a woman down the road, Mrs. Sutherland, not far from where we lived in Christchurch. She had a block of land, never been developed. And I said to her one day, would she mind if I grew potatoes on it? It was about 2 acres. She said, yes, as long as you give me enough potatoes for a year, there'll be no rent. So I did that with Chippewa potatoes. 2 of us did it. I dug them all by hand, took 40 boxes of potatoes in a day into the market with Dad's car and trailer, had 2 paper rounds. I was working on a farm in Methven, a very good farmer, and I broke my arm with a Ford 5000 tractor. I was taking out fence posts. It was in the weekend. There was a knob on the steering wheel, and in those days, those tractors didn't have power steering, and it spun back through the steering wheel and broke my wrist in 2 places. I remember at the time thinking when I was lying on the ground for a few minutes in a bit of pain, this is what young New Zealand men were going through in Vietnam. It was about vaguely at the same time. I got back to the homestead and the doctor said to me, look, you're going to be lifting with this arm. You really should not do any lifting for 3 months. You'll break it again. That's how it was. So I went back home and learned how to touch type and did a welding course, gas and engineering. Made a lot of roof racks, made a lot of boat trailers. I was lucky Dad and Mum had a big garage that I could use. So I had a head start there, but mainly it was because I had fire in the belly from about 10 years old.
Now that's really wonderful to hear, and that sounds quite excruciatingly painful, breaking your wrist that way, but that you turned that into an opportunity to learn new skills and keep that fire burning with working hard. It sounds like you've put in a lifetime of hard work, Peter, and I'm so glad to hear you enjoy it.
Well, I'm still working 7 days at Hamlet. There's nothing I would rather do, Beck. I know golf's a marvellous game. I'm still doing a bit of public speaking around the country, and I get a lot of feedback from the articles I write, which is just common sense stuff. I mean, to be fair, something I haven't mentioned is that I go to America every year, and I have travelled 7 times in America. Last time I was there, I did 30,000 kilometres. I have a partner who was a sheep farmer in Kaikoura, Nikki, and she lost her husband the same time as my wife. We travelled together. We both like driving. And I've learned a lot. Every time there's a farmer on the side of the road anywhere in America, I stop and talk to him. I just find them a very interesting group to move around. And I will be back again there in April with a bit of luck with Nikki.
Wonderful. It sounds like you've had some really good trips over there. And as a person who receives your articles and updates via email, I do enjoy reading them and hearing your insights into our farming systems, global farming systems, and financial systems. So, yeah, I can definitely vouch for those. So I'd quickly like to put you in the hot seat, Peter. Can you tell us your funniest story relating to farming or agriculture?
I've enjoyed the journey so much that I have a lot of good experiences. For example, this is not a funny story, but it's interesting. Just the other day, I wrote an article about climate migration. and mentioned there's a band around the equator that if they get too warm, they will move north, and there'll be enormous numbers of them. I came into the office the following day, Saturday morning, and there was an email from 4 young men in Crete, C-R-E-T-E in Greece, and they said they had received a copy of my article from someone in Australia, I never gathered who, and they said, we are not climate migration people, but we are financial migration people. The 4 of us are sharing a house in Crete. Our families are still in Syria. We can't bring them into Greece. We've been trying to get jobs and get asylum into Europe, and we are all struggling. But your article was very real for us. If Syria gets much warmer, there will be enormous migration going on, bigger numbers than you've ever had before. Now, I thought, goodness, it's not, I haven't quite answered your question, but I do get a lot of this type of thing coming at me, Beck.
Yeah, it sounds like your articles reach far and wide, and you must get some fascinating stories of people from all around the world who relate to them. So I want to just change tact a little bit here. So the work I do with the whole story, and this podcast series, in fact, is based around the framework of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this episode in particular is focused on goal number 8, which is around decent work and economic growth. And I just want to dive into that goal a little bit further, in particularly around the targets 8.2, which is around achieving higher levels of economic productivity through diversification, technological upgrading, and innovation, including through a focus on high value added and labour-intensive sectors. And I wanted to know your thoughts, Peter, on how that might apply to New Zealand agriculture.
Yes, that's an interesting phrase, that. Couple of points here. It's only the top 2 farming quartiles that will be interested in that approach. If you're actually being absolutely honest, Becks, you won't find that the bottom quartile in any farming country actually moves much out of that quartile, right? It's just, we like to think that we can take a bottom quartile farmer or business person and move them up the ranks into a top quartile. Well, that never happens. You might move them into the bottom of the next quartile. So it's only the top 2 quartiles that you will find you'll get real interest in using current innovation and improving things and improving their output. All right. The bottom quartile in particular is very comfortable with just getting enough cash in the system to keep family and themselves going. They can still be good in the community, but in the sense of improving the country and the farm's output, you won't find much goes on. I struck that many times in my troubleshooting. They were still good people to deal with. It's interesting, if you just move sideways here a bit, Fonterra has been announcing in the last little while that they're getting a reduced number of kilograms of milk solids. It's true that there's a few other cooperatives that would have taking up some of that production, but the point I'm getting at is we are mature in the sense of milk solids production in New Zealand. Now that means that any improvement, Fonterra, is going to take place in things like marketing and increased number of products. In other words, a bit like Nestle have been doing in Switzerland for many, many years. So at a certain point, New Zealand is going to be mature in the sense of a lot of its farm production, and it's going to get back to marketing and innovation, sometimes reduce costs, but strategic thinking. It won't be how to increase the production itself, it'll be strategic thinking and making use of that production.
And what are your thoughts around the meat sector then?
Let's face it, Becks, we've come down from 70 million to about 25 million now. Australia's come back from 170 million to 70 million. The highest numbers were about 1981. We've been coming back ever since. I have always thought that if our sheep numbers get below 20 million, we'll have problems at the works, not enough throughput. But at the moment, our meat people are very good at marketing. let's face it, we are pretty good in that area, but the same thing applies. I think we're well and truly mature in our numbers of production. I would have a lot of confidence in both Fonterra and our meat companies that they will cope.
You've been working with farmers through a lot of different highs and lows, Peter, and working particularly with those top 2 quartiles. I mean, what strategies do you see those farmers putting in place to be able to ride those highs and lows?
Firstly, they have a good apprenticeship. I never forget working with a farmer once, and he said he had 2 sons and he had a big farm, and they both wanted to come home, and he said, well, you're going to have to work 5 years for another farmer. You won't learn much from me living in the bedroom adjoining me. And I thought, what an interesting approach that was. He wanted these boys to get out and deal with another employee, and that's what he did. And these 2 boys, they've split the farm up, but they're still there. So first thing is a good apprenticeship, absolutely crucial. No different to any other industry, but a good apprenticeship. You cannot shortcut a good apprenticeship. Secondly, they need strong financial management. They've just got to be strong with financial stuff. Years ago, it was good enough if you could move sheep around and knew when to move them and fence and all that fertilizer. Today, that is still important, but financial management, the best returns a farmer is ever going to get is in his farm office. He'll get a high hourly rate with making some good decisions in there. Thirdly, don't start this second marriage, third marriage stuff. He needs a partner who's on the same page. And it's very important that they get this first decision right, because the number of times I'm dealing with broken marriages and what have you, it's an absolute pain. And they lose 5 years of their life, and they lose half the capital sometimes. So those are the 3 areas they need to be good at. And they need to have a passion for agriculture. I mean, a top farmer will always go to a well-run seminar within 50k of his farm. If there's good speakers at those seminars, people who speak truth, who have been through the pain, he'll go and listen. And those very well-run on-farm seminars, conferences, they'll go to it, they'll learn from it. I mean, a good operator puts his listening and learning overalls on every time he goes out the farm gate to one of those.
Yeah, I think it's a really good opportunity for people listening to take that on board, is that, put your listening and learning overalls on when you leave the farm gate and be able to bring that knowledge back to implement into your farming system. So looking at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, Peter, which one of those would you say that you align with most personally, and why?
I am interested in the gender, the one at the moment. The New Zealand gender difference, male and female, in salaries is about 9.2%, I think. It's interesting, in my practice since 1972, we have always paid the same. So if a man and woman have got the same qualifications, the same ability, if you like, we would pay the same. So we have never had that imbalance that I keep reading about.
Yeah, I think that's really refreshing to hear. And it's quite a shocking statistic, really, that people would be paid less just based on their gender. So, I hope to see New Zealand continue to improve in that space. So what do you see as the biggest challenge to New Zealand's agricultural sector, Peter, regarding sustainability? And I guess how would you take your experience and knowledge and turn that into an opportunity?
Yes, that's a very good question. My first answer to that would be quite a few of our politicians have never run a business. They have never, ever had a situation where they've got a paycheck to find on Thursday night and they haven't got it. A lot of people in business go through hell and back, keeping things going, not letting good staff go. We get what we pay for. We get what we vote for. I suppose, Becks, what I'd say is even in New Zealand, we are lacking good, strong leadership in a number of areas. So sustainability It's going to be hard, for example, with these new emissions that government's talking about. If you think you're going to drop us meat and wool returns by 18 to 24%, that was their figure. That's not a workable figure. That means 20% of our farmers are going to go to the wall, so to speak. That's not sustainable. Personally, I would have thought with things like emissions, I don't see why it should be just completely a farming problem. I would have thought that it's in the interests of every urban person as well to have a country that if it has to reduce its exports or it has to make them more sustainable in the sense of emissions, it's good for the whole country, not just debiting every single sheep and beef and dairy farmer in the country with the problem. But we don't seem to be taking that view. If people on the other side of the world are going to only buy our produce because we've done something with emissions, then we probably have to follow that line. But I don't think we should be debiting just farmers. I think it's a New Zealand people issue and needs to be dealt with in that way.
Yeah, I think that's really important too, Peter. And I'd like to hear, I guess, around the challenges we face in leadership. What do you think the opportunity is there? Like, how do we change that?
Yeah, that's another very good question. It's interesting that a new director at Fonterra ends up going to, I think it's the Stanford University. I might have the university wrong, but it goes to Stanford for a month or so. And a lot of our top companies send people mainly to America to get themselves on a higher level of management. Sometimes it's about governance, sometimes it's about management, but that's one of the issues. I've been trying to get Lincoln University to send people over to the universities like Harvard. It's the sort of thing that we need to be encouraging our top people to get better at what they do. I have sat down in Dallas at a meeting with an individual who was seconded by Obama. He just seemed to be an ordinary individual. He was an engineer. And in the morning tea break, we both got talking, and he said he had a very good engineering business in New York. He got seconded by Obama. His salary went down. He didn't give me the exact figures, but he said, I ended up with a peanut salary, but I worked for Obama for 2 years, secondment, and he said it was my way of injecting back into the industry, but he said it's turned out that I've learned a terrific amount. He said, I didn't think I would learn a terrific amount, but I did. So investing money in people, Becks, is one of the best ways of getting better leadership.
Yeah, I agree with that, Peter. And I think that's also another interesting point you raised there, is that when people think that they're giving back and they're contributing to their industry, actually you'll find most of the time they end up coming away with more than they feel like they've put in, which I think hopefully would encourage people to keep that mindset of giving back and contributing, because you always get what you put in back in spades.
Yes, I completely agree. Personally, I enjoy investing back in the industry. I'm not too worried that I don't get much for it, but investing in the industry and leaving things better than when I started, it's got to be a plus.
Yeah, and you certainly have done that over your career, Peter, and continue to do so today. So what's on the cards for the next 12 months for Pita Alexander?
I think if you enjoy what you do, you'll almost invariably be good at it. And that is a fundamental phrase, I think, that is certainly guiding me for the next 12 months. I'm enjoying it. Farming couples respond well. I'm not saying we agree on everything, but it is very satisfying dealing with not only farming couples, but business couples who want to get ahead. It is fair comment that there's wealth and income inequality around the world. There is. Some countries are very bad. The top 10% control about 80% of the wealth. Now, you'd say sooner or later that's civil unrest country. and I think it will be. But at the same time, I'm spending all my time trying to make sure my clients have a higher income and a higher wealth position. In other words, there's a big group of us that are actually working full-time, very hard to make sure our clients have wealth and income inequality. And I always find that interesting. The world talks about the share market diversification. If you actually dig into that a bit, you'll find that most of the millionaires or multi-millionaires in this country haven't diversified. They are business people who have developed a very narrow, deep situation in their own backyard. Top farmers are a good example of that. They're narrow and they're deep and they've got an enormous understanding. It's not quite a fair comparison with the share market where you do need to diversify, but it's interesting that a lot of wealth doesn't come from diversification. It comes from intense, narrow depth.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's actually better for society to have lots of people taking that narrow and deep approach, creating a diverse society rather than diversification within individual business.
My main answer to your last question was, if you're enjoying it, you'll be good at it and you'll take the trouble to make sure you understand the regulations, you listen to the top innovators, you take up the new ideas. Maybe you're not the first person to take it up, but you'll be the second or third. You'll take up the new ideas and the odd one won't work, but you are moving with the times.
Yeah, I definitely think that's great advice. And so to summarize our whole conversation, really, because I like to leave people on a real practical note, what's one practical take-home action that farming businesses can take to contribute to their sustainability, Peter?
Sometimes I find I go into a farming situation and the individual, usually the man, is not actually enjoying it. For some reason, he took over the farm because dad wanted him to or mum wanted him to. I think it is a shame if you're not getting job satisfaction 90% of the time. Don't worry about 100%. In other words, head for excellence. Forget perfection at 100. Excellence is 90%. You need to be getting job satisfaction 90% of the time. The other 10%, people will muck it up anyway. So don't hope for more than 90%. If you're getting a lot less than 90% job satisfaction, you're in the wrong job. Whose fault is it? It's your fault.
I think that's really important, Peter. And I think it comes back to what you said before, that if you're enjoying it, then you'll be good at it. And
Yes.
if you'll take on board the learnings and the necessary hard work to get things done and be successful at what you're enjoying.
Yeah, right. Absolutely right.
Perfect. Oh, well, I'd like to thank you so much for your time today, Peter, and your generosity of experience and the stories you have to share and your insights from a sort of a global accountancy perspective. And yeah, just thank you so much for sharing that with myself and my listeners.
Becks, you're welcome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Whole Story podcast. We really hope you enjoyed it and are feeling inspired and optimistic about putting sustainability into practice on farm. I have one last request for you before you go. Make sure, whatever platform you're listening to us on, that you hit follow and share the show or episodes with your friends, so that together we can grow our community and inspire sustainability in agriculture in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And thanks again to FMG for partnering with The Whole Story so that we could bring this podcast to life for you all to enjoy. Catch you next time.